Okay, we need the next big thing. I think we need a show that feels sort of thin, stretched, like butter scraped over too much bread. Oh, have I got the show for you. Hey nerds, what's up? If you've been following along with me, you'll know that I had really high hopes and was very optimistic about the Rings of Power TV show, especially in the first few episodes. Sure, they weren't perfect, but I thought they were going in a really good direction. Unfortunately, the show just ended up being kind of bad and disappointing. And as a clarification, you'll notice through this video that absolutely none of my gripes have anything to do with lore. I made my lore comparison videos more to be informational for people who had no desire to read Tolkien's lore, to just talk about the differences. I wasn't trying to criticize the show. I knew they didn't have the rights to Silmarillion. My only goal with Rings of Power was to be entertained. And as my joking intro implies, it just failed to be entertaining and also failed on just basic storytelling principles. A meandering show that sometimes felt completely random. The showrunners were just unable to build reliable tension, follow through on plot lines, and make good character arcs. As a show, it tried to be deep and meaningful without earning it, instead relying on things like slow-mo, music cues, and idle lines about hope. For a show that had so much potential and looked absolutely gorgeous, the end result just felt kind of flat. So let's get into the nitty-gritty. The first thing we need to address here is the joke I made in the beginning, which is that there wasn't enough plot to justify over 8 hours of show. Now, to be clear, I'm fine with a slow show, but generally when you have a slower show, it focuses deeply on characters and character motivations and character arcs, but unfortunately that was also missing from the show. But we'll talk about characters later. One of the big culprits of this issue, in my opinion, was just sheer number of plot lines and characters that were introduced in this show. You may be saying, but Bookborn, the Silmarillion has a ton of characters, and you like a lot of things with big casts and characters. They were just following Tolkien. They had to do it. But I am gonna criticize it because in this case, they did it wrong. Let's take a look at two books that are known for their large cast of characters, The Wheel of Time and The Stormlight Archive. You may have heard of Wheel of Time's notoriously large cast of characters, but what you may not know if you haven't read the book is that the first 60% of the first book is all from one character's perspective. And even when it does change perspective, only 9% of the chapters are from a different character's perspective than the main one. And even in book 2, when it expands to 15 unique POVs, 66% of the chapters contain Rand's POV. Rand is the anchor. We may have multiple storylines, but we have a clear main voice. It waits to expand till later in the series. The Stormlight Archive tells a very similar story. If we look at book 1, Kaladin has over double the number of chapters as the next POV character, giving him just under 50% of the novel by chapter numbers. He is our clear anchor in the story. The point I'm trying to make is that you need an anchor, and although in the first 2 episodes, ones that I thought were probably some of the most successful ones, clearly had Galadriel as the anchor, we moved further and further away from that, making the story very hard to get a grasp on and understand how everything related to each other. We introduced too many POVs too soon, and honestly we can say that happened in the first couple episodes, even though I thought it was fine there. The problem introduced there just kept snowballing in later episodes. The next thing that's a problem with the plot is that several things could be removed from the show and literally have zero effect on the entire season. If the entire Harfoot storyline was removed, literally nothing would change. It had zero effect on any of the other plot lines. And when you stitch all the Harfoot stuff together, you'll realize how thin it really was. Not much happened. Things just kept repeating themselves, which we're gonna talk about a little bit later. And that same thing happened with other characters that I actually expressed concern about in my other videos from the very moment they were introduced. For example, Isildur's sister and the king's son. I questioned why we were introducing even more characters into the narrative when it felt like we didn't really understand the others, and those two characters literally never justified their appearance the entire season. What was the point of giving them time if they had zero effect on the story? You may be saying right now about the Harfoots, well, the stranger was important, but the only thing he really did was give a red herring about Sauron. And even if the stranger becomes very important in season 2, because that storyline was so thin, it would be easy to cover the same amount of ground in half a single episode in season 2 of the first episode. Additionally, there is a negative to having a TV show versus a movie, which I've heard showrunners express in the past, which is that people expect each episode to have its own narrative within the larger narrative. Unfortunately, The Rings of Power really mostly treated this as an 8-hour-long movie, and no episodes had their own storyline, which made it difficult to anchor. In fact, some of the episodes I think people liked most, like episode 6, were the ones that had the most complete storyline within a single episode, and I think that's why they worked more, because they were following that format. Now, I realize that's very difficult to do in a show like this, but I do think the lack of attention to that also hurt the show when it came to plot. This ties into storytelling issue number 2 I had, which is telling the same thing over and over and over again. It's common knowledge that when writing stories, every scene should be working. In other words, every scene should mean something, not necessarily having to be moving plot forward, but it should tell us something more about a character, about a location, about lore, or about the world, or about themes. It should be working for something. No scene should just be in there for no purpose. I noticed so often in the show that they did not follow that principle. And if it happened every once in a while, whatever. But I started noticing happening frequently, like several times per episode. Let's show some examples of this. The first one I can think of that was shown over and over again was that the stranger could do magic. And these scenes seemed to serve no other purpose but that. We were shown it as if it was some reveal when Isildur's sister finds the seer. But that was already revealed to us several episodes prior. That scene really showed nothing else. We see Galadriel fight a lot, and these scenes never do more than just show us her martial prowess, which was already established several times, including the very first episode. Or my personal favorite, when we have at least 4 conversations from different characters in the season finale about hope. And I could name so many more. You don't need all those scenes saying the same thing over and over again. If we talk about efficient storytelling, we want each scene to mean something new about our characters, about the plot, or about the world. I think this contributed to the show often feeling boring and feeling extremely long and not earning its runtime. This also causes characterization to suffer because we aren't revealing new things about our characters frequently enough, making our characters feel a little bit more thin. So now it's time to talk about characterization issues, which I kind of feel like we're all over the place and with several characters, but I'd like to focus on Galadriel because I think she illustrates the larger problem in the rest of the show. In the first 2 episodes, we set up that Galadriel might be getting a little dark. She's touching the darkness. Okay, that's clear. This is a story point for us. But then this really isn't addressed in the next few episodes, as she's shown being always right and that we should probably be on her side. Then suddenly in episode 6, we get an absolutely vicious Galadriel that is full-on dark genocidal and completely lacking empathy for a tortured one of her own kind. While I actually didn't mind this at all as a storyline, it had been completely unsupported by the previous couple episodes. But then we go back right after that to normal Galadriel in episode 7. She's seen talking with Theo and acting more like the Galadriel we expect from the books, as if nothing in episode 6 had happened. And she mentions a husband, making her seem older, when before in the episode she was seeming and acting very young. It feels unrelated. Then back to episode 8 where she's fighting against Halbrand/Sauron, but then continues to do the work he started. And then says she didn't feel worthy of going to the West in episode 1 when that clearly didn't seem the case at all in that episode. We should have been shown that inner turmoil, not told. It clearly seemed in episode 1 that she just didn't want to go to the West. Overall, it's like they couldn't quite commit to any of their character decisions on Galadriel, making it hard for me to connect to her as a character because I didn't understand her arc. Where is she going in this TV show? I don't care about where she's going in lore, I mean just in the TV show. And unfortunately, we see this issue clearly with other characters. I think of Unearned, who I really connected to at the beginning of the show, and then they just left him there to dry with nothing else to do. Or Bronwyn from, in a single episode, waffles from we will fight to no, we'll be hopeless to the first scene in the next episode is we're gonna fight again. It didn't seem clear who she was. A lot of it's just dropped storylines. We have this whole storyline about Theo that just never comes to anything. In the very first episode, we saw Elrond on a storyline about being an outcast since he's half elven, and it's literally never addressed again for the next 7 hours. Or Halbrand as Sauron, his storyline makes particularly no sense. Honestly, I really love the Halbrand as Sauron thing because it actually is pretty good to lore, where he was tricking everybody and shapeshifting, and that was great, but they need to make the storyline make sense. His whole Southland King thing is so convoluted if he was trying to manipulate Galadriel, because we so earnestly see him react to her as convincing him to be the king of the Southlands. He'd be yeah, but that was the point. It's just such a convoluted plan. And so again, it just seems almost random at the end. It didn't seem like they actually had a through line of who he was, so that we could go back and watch episodes and be oh, that's when he was being manipulative. Why was he on a raft in the middle of the ocean? He knew Galadriel was gonna jump and see him? Like that's where I struggle. I think the only character in the show who had a very clear character arc was Adar, and I think it's no surprise that so many people felt very connected to him. But even a lot of his time on screen ended up feeling wasted, even though I think he was one of the most compelling characters, because we knew who he was. On to another thing I noticed about the show, which was their desperate attempt to gain emotional currency without really understanding what creates an actual emotional response in the viewers. There were so many times I could tell the show wanted me to feel something, but I felt nothing because it felt manufactured. And how did I know they wanted me to feel something? It was a pretty simple formula. The music would swell in the background, there would often be a lot of slow-mo, and someone would say a statement and pause after like it was extremely profound. I wish I could show all the music swelling cues, but my video would be immediately taken down, so unfortunately you would just have to watch the show again, but notice music cues. You can even notice this as early as the first episode. It seemed like they felt like all they needed was production to make a moment meaningful, and that writing or character choices weren't actually at the heart of that. I tried to think of something that I watched the most recently that gained an emotional reaction out of me, and I immediately thought of season 4 of Stranger Things. I won't show any clips or say anything what it's about in case you haven't watched it, but if I say the term running up that hill, people who've watched the show will know exactly what scene I'm talking about. It was clearly the most emotional scene of the season. Everyone was talking about it after it happened. Probably gonna be written down as one of the most iconic scenes in TV because it just had such an impact. And I tried to analyze, why did that scene have such impact? And it was a buildup. That scene was a culmination of several hints and clues and character arcs and storylines that had been happening in every episode prior to it. So when it finally happened, yes, it was supported by music cues. It even was supported sometimes by slow-mo, but those were just added elements to something that was supported also in the writing. And when I think of other impactful moments like that, it's usually always that case. Because we didn't have clear character arcs or clear plot direction, those meaningful moments ended up feeling hollow. And just like as a side note, another thing they sometimes tried to do was just copy scenes from Lord of the Rings that people love in Rings of Power, assuming that it would work there, again without any real understanding of why they worked in the original. Okay, so the 3 things we just talked about I think actually are at the crux of why the Rings of Power suffered as a TV show. So the next couple things I'm going to talk about are just a lot smaller that I think contributed to it, but not nearly as much as the plot and characterization issues. The first I want to talk about is what I'm going to call power creep. Now, this is something that is not unique to Rings of Power and is something I've been noticing in franchise revivals recently, especially the new Obi-Wan, where characters are becoming extremely more powerful than the original properties. Particularly in ROP, I felt that Galadriel's feats felt very heightened from the feats we saw in LOTR, even if sometimes incredible, they came less frequently, and the cult member's magical power, which felt insanely high. The problem with magical creep is that it lacks the foundational understanding that limitations to magic is often what makes it the most interesting. And that too powerful magic, especially when it doesn't exist in the original story, can create a ton of problems down the line for you, because people can be like, well, they did that before, why can't they just do it again here? Okay, and the second small thing that I have to mention is just like the amount of little things that just didn't make sense and are pretty stupid when you really think about them. Again, a few of these wouldn't matter, but they just kept piling up. Like Galadriel jumping into the water in the middle of the ocean, that weird horse scene, her not moving and staring into a literal erupting volcano, having drama around 2 characters dying that are literally 2 characters that we absolutely have to know are alive because they're in the original LOTR trilogy, even if you only saw the movies. The stranger yelling, "I am good." Nori being scared of the magic when he was like literally in a trance and it was clearly an accident. Everyone cheering for a king that nobody had literally mentioned ever before in that storyline. Water flowing uphill to get to a volcano. Heck, the sword apparently being a device for breaking a dam in like a mechanical way. A rope taking down a tower. Leaving a defensible tower for an indefensible town. Like I said before, any one of these issues are very easy to ignore. For example, when Galadriel jumped into the water in the first episode, I kind of laughed at it, but it didn't hurt my perception of that episode at all, to be honest. I enjoyed it, and I liked it, and that wasn't gonna bug me. But when they keep piling up over every single episode, I literally asked myself after that horse scene, like, nobody questioned that scene? Nobody wanted to edit that scene out? And it does make me wonder, were there just too many cooks in the kitchen? I was pointed out by my friend Kyle from Read by Kyle that in the intro of Rings of Power, not a single actor is named. In fact, it's only like executive producers and whatever. Is that an indicator that it was just simply too many people and therefore no vision was promoted? So what would have made it better? I maintain that this show had a ton of potential, and it wasn't like it was just bad from start to finish and there was nothing good about that. I actually don't think that at all. Now in my Wheel of Time review, I did like a little rewrite of episode 8, and I wanted to do a little bit of that here just to show some examples of using what they set up and how it could have just been a cleaner storyline from start to finish. A disclaimer: I do not think I'd be a good showrunner. I do not think I'd be a good writer. I do not think I am better than the showrunners or writers who did this show. I am just putting forward some observations I noticed that I think could make a cleaner story. So first, yes, I'd completely get rid of the Harfoot storyline. We don't need hobbits in the show. I sometimes think they only put them in because they felt like viewers expected hobbits. And yes, the stranger did pull some tension pretending he was Sauron and then Halbrand was Sauron, but I actually think it cheapened the Halbrand reveal. At no point in the show was it clear that we were supposed to be looking for Sauron. Like, that wasn't a mystery I don't think the show needed. If the stranger is important in season 2, I think they should move his little meteor reveal maybe to the very last episode as like a go watch season 2, like as a teaser for that, and then just condense that whole storyline into the first episode. There are other things we can get rid of as well, like Isildur's sister, whose name I can't remember, which is why I keep calling her that, and the king's son. They're not needed in the story. They add bloat and take away time from developing other more important storylines. Honestly, the storyline they set up for Galadriel in episodes 1 and 2 I think could be very good to continue out through the story, keep that whole touch of the darkness. One thing that I think could be interesting is what if instead of making Galadriel a bad commander that they felt like they had to get rid of, what if everyone was in love with her? Kind of like how we see later Arndor is like, oh, that's Galadriel, the leader of the armies or whatever. How about everyone viewed her that way? Like, she's amazing. But maybe we see her do something that's super suspect, like she gets a little too dark. She kills someone she shouldn't have. She does something that she realizes was wrong in the pursuit of Sauron, but nobody else knows. So everyone sees her as this amazing person and she's conflicted. So when they send her to the West, instead of as a punishment, she's being sent to the West because they all revere her. So when she jumps off the boat at the end of this episode 1, we understand it's because her internal conflict, and we know right then it's because she doesn't feel like she's worthy. And maybe her goal the entire season is to become worthy of that. And so when she becomes friends with Halbrand and she thinks she's influencing him for good, but really what we don't know is he's influencing her towards the dark, that's a thing. So maybe she always thinks she's doing good, and then we get to the last episode when they realize that she has been BFFs with Sauron this entire time. The thing she has been trying to fight, the reason she's thought she's getting better was actually her just touching the darkness the entire time. What a character moment that would be, right? That would be a lot of emotional turmoil for Galadriel. We'd wonder where she was gonna go in season 2. I think it would just be a clear storyline. It would make sense. Maybe we would see Halbrand egging her on with Adar, saying that she's right to be that brutal. So it would be things that we would see her as viewers getting worse, but she would think she was getting better. I'm not saying that's perfect. I do think it would be at least more consistent than the Galadriel we see in the show. And without the Harfoots, we could perhaps focus more on the Durin and Elrond's storyline. Obviously, they had tons of chemistry, and I think most people really enjoyed their parts of the show. So maybe we could develop a little bit more of a plotline for them. Instead of Mithril healing the elves, maybe there's just a little bit better storyline there. You know, crafting the Rings of Power, I think, are probably one of the most interesting bits of the show for people who love the lore and don't know anything about it alike. Everyone knows about the rings. What if the dwarves were more involved in helping with the rings? That could be very interesting. I don't know exactly how Numenor would fit into here. I really love the Numenor parts. I'd love if they kept them in. Maybe we could see Halbrand also influencing Numenor for the worse. I don't think Numenor ever needed to be involved in the Southland storyline. I felt like it was pretty purposeless. So maybe the Southland storyline is the one storyline that's separate, but we could see it come together in the end because we see that Adar was preparing the Southlands for Sauron. I'm not sure about how that would fit in. I think that storyline needed to have more plot as well. Okay, I know that wasn't that detailed. My takeaway is just, I think the show would have benefited from understanding clear character arcs, particularly for Galadriel and Halbrand, and how they related to each other. I think we need way more focus on the crafting of the rings. Definitely one of the most interesting parts of the lore. And again, for people who have never even read a single word of Tolkien and have only seen the movies, I think the crafting of the rings would be very interesting to them. So I'm confused at why we didn't focus a lot more on that. I think you could have 1, even 2 episodes focusing on that, where we have the dwarves and Elrond and Galadriel and Halbrand all working together so those storylines converge. Okay, Usually I talk about this earlier in my critique episodes, but it just kind of fit more here. I do want to talk about the things that I liked about the show. I know this video is already long, but I'd just be really remiss if I didn't mention it. The obvious thing first, the show was gorgeous, okay? We do see where the budget went. I mean, not to writing, but the budget went to the CGI and it showed. The sweeping landscapes were just beautiful, and I couldn't stop looking at them. Durin and Risa were top tier. They brought dwarfs to life. They made dwarfs feel distinctly different than humans and elves, something that didn't really happen between elves and humans. Also, Durin and Elrond just had great on-screen chemistry, and I loved all the scenes they were in. I also weirdly love Miriel. I know she was a really small role, but she was just so convincing to me. I wish her storyline was a little bit more purposeful in respect to the rest of the show, but I found myself really rooting for her. I really believed in her and her story. Honestly, a lot of the actors in the show were very good, I think. Isildur's dad, Halbrand, unfortunately just didn't give Halbrand sustenance storyline, but I think he did a good job with what he had. And Arondir, although again, his story didn't do him justice. I also liked that they were trying to set up a character arc for Galadriel. They didn't just go with the typical, she's a perfect elf. I know a lot of people wanted that, but I think it was smart of them to give us a character who was gonna have flaws that needed to work through something. That's just gonna make a more interesting show. And I liked that, I just don't think they delivered necessarily on it. Okay, I'm finally done talking. As you see, in summary, I don't think The Rings of Power is the worst TV show I've ever seen. I actually think it just had a lot of potential and fell flat, and it just didn't do enough to justify its 8 hours of runtime. I honestly don't care that it didn't follow lore. I've talked about that so many times in other videos you can go watch. I knew it wasn't going to. I just wanted to be entertained and feel like I was visiting Tolkien's world again. And in fairness, it did feel like Tolkien's world. I mean, it was beautiful, but there just wasn't a lot of substance there in the end. To be honest, I just felt bored. The last episode literally felt like it lasted forever. I asked my husband twice during the episode how much time we had left because I thought it has to almost be over now, doesn't it? Anyway, I'd love to know what you thought about The Rings of Power. I know some of you really loved it, and if it worked for you, like I always say, I am so glad. I don't want people to dislike things that I love. I love Tolkien and I wanted this to be a success. If you didn't like it, let me know the reasons you didn't like it. Did you catch some of the things I caught about storytelling? Or are you one of the people that the lore was the part that really bugged you? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, if you like these kind of videos, please like and subscribe and share. It really helps me when my videos get shared organically. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.